Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started here in a moment. We'll give it a couple more seconds and we'll get started. All right. Well, maybe we should just start getting this rolling here. So hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dan Graham. I am the chapter president for the Los Angeles and Orange County chapters of the Vanderbilt Alumni Association. And I am honored, privileged to introduce our speaker tonight. Professor Jonathan Hiskey he's a professor of political science at Vandy with a courtesy appointment in the Department of Sociology. So his research explores the ways in which flaws in a country's political system affect its citizens. In his recent book, Life in the Political Machine, published by Oxford University Press, he examines the political attitudes and behaviors of individuals who live in subnational dominant party enclaves in Mexico and Argentina. A related line of research concerns the political implications of migration for sending communities across Latin America. Hiskey's work on these topics has appeared in leading political science journals such as Comparative Political Studies, the British Journal of Political Science, and the American Journal of Political Science. So without further ado, let's turn this over to Professor Hiskey and get this program started.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Caroline and AJ, for putting this together. And thank you all for showing up and coming into the Commodore classroom virtually. I hope you like my Nashville skyline background. I thought it might generate some memories you might have and maybe encourage you to come back to Nashville at some point. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. And get started with PowerPoint. Okay. So the title of tonight's talk is Changing U.S. Immigration Policy Along the Southwest Border. And I wanted to start with asking the question of what does immigration policy really mean? And if you think about it, it entails quite a number of policy areas, border security, visa programs, refugee resettlement, etc. I could spend 40 minutes talking about each one of these topics. And indeed, I offer a class on immigration policy that lasts 16 weeks. So if you're interested, you can get in touch with me later. But tonight, we're going to focus on the policy issues related to the Southwest border. I thought that might be of interest to those out west. So let's get started. So the roadmap, excuse me, for tonight is we're going to start with the map quiz. And then we'll talk a bit about trends in U.S. immigration along the Southwest border. We're going to then look at some sources of changes that have taken place in those migration patterns, look at U.S. immigration policy responses to those changes, and then I'll close with some observations. And I hope we have plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So the map quiz. All right, don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on the entire world map. Rather, we're going to focus just on Central America. So get out your pen and paper, or you can do this just a mental quiz. And I'll even make it easy for you by giving you the answers to number one. That, of course, is Mexico. Okay, so your challenge is to answer 2 through 8. What are those countries? I'll give you just a few seconds to jot down your answers. I'm sure everyone's going to get 100%, so we don't need to do this, but just in case, we need to make sure we know the geography of the countries we're talking about. Okay, so here are the answers. We start up top with Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. You get them all right? Well, if you didn't, I'm going to give you one of my tried and true mnemonics that I've tried out in many classes before, and it always works. And it is better get extra help, never commit plagiarism. Okay, so better Belize, get Guatemala, extra El Salvador, help Honduras, never Nicaragua, commit Costa Rica, and plagiarism Panama. All right, so you got the map of Central America down. You're never going to forget it. You can impress all your friends and family with your newfound knowledge of Central American geography. So with that out of the way, let's get started. And let's look at some trends in US immigration along the Southwest border. And this is perhaps one of the most important charts I'm going to show you tonight. What we see here are the numbers of individuals apprehended at the US Southwest border between 1925 and 2020. And what you should immediately notice is that since peaking in 2000 at a little over 1.6 million, we have been in a 20-year decline in the number of apprehensions, reaching a low in 2017 of just under 400,000. And we do have a peak. This is the caravan effect, if you will, in 2019. And we can talk about that later if you like. But in general, what this chart suggests is that we are seeing unprecedented low levels of illegal border crossings at the Southwest border, unlike any we've seen since the early 1970s. And to add to that, I want to make mention of 2 points about this chart. So number one, the number of apprehensions generally is the most common metric we use to measure the number of border EWIs, as they're referred to, entry without inspection, put it another way, illegal border crossings. And because we can't measure the number of people that actually successfully cross the border, the next best measure is this apprehension data provided by Customs and Border Protection. Secondly, the apprehension rate over the past 20 years has improved significantly. That is, we have gotten better at catching people crossing the border. The Office of Immigration Statistics estimates that in 2005, we're catching around 50% of those attempting to cross, and that's improved to about 70% by 2015. So taken in combination with what you see in the chart, we are catching more people who are crossing the border, and yet we're apprehending far fewer than we were 20 years ago. This is a very significant takeaway, I think, for you all when talking about immigration at the border, in the midst of rhetoric that often portrays what's taking place at the border in the past few years as unprecedented numbers of individuals crossing the border. That's simply not the case. Let's look a little deeper at these numbers. So here you have a chart that has 2 lines. The gold line are the numbers, the individuals from Mexico who have been apprehended at the border. And you see that's where the bulk of the decline over the past 20 years has taken place in. In the year 2000, close to 99% of the individuals apprehended at the border were coming from Mexico, born in Mexico. That number has declined sharply to under 200,000 in the past several years. The other category that CBP uses is other than Mexico. That is all individuals apprehended at the border that come from a country, that were born in a country other than Mexico. And as you can see, those numbers started to rise around 2011, 2012, with much of the spike in 2019 being a result of individuals from countries other than Mexico. So what are those countries other than Mexico where these individuals are coming from? Well, 90% of the other than Mexico category comes from 3 countries in Central America. Get extra help. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are the 3 countries that make up the bulk of this other than Mexico category. And as you can see, again, since 2012, these numbers have been on a steady increase and really jumped in 2019, with Honduras and Guatemala having sharp increases during that year, El Salvador slightly less so. And just as an aside, in the charts I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides, in each of those charts, the countries are represented by the colors. So Guatemala will always be red, Honduras will always be green, and El Salvador will always be blue, okay? Okay, so the country of origin of individuals arriving at the border has changed dramatically over the past several years. What else has changed? Well, who is arriving has changed just as dramatically, excuse me. We've seen increases in the number of unaccompanied children, increases in the number of family units apprehended, and a steady increase in the percentage of women that are apprehended at the border. What hasn't changed are the apprehension rates of single adults. And here you see a decline in Mexico and a fairly steady rate of single adult apprehensions in the 3 countries of interest, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. All right, so we know that things have changed quite a bit at the southwest border. The numbers are drastically down from what they were 20 years ago, and the types of people that are arriving at the border has changed quite a bit as well. What are the sources of these change? Why are we seeing this now? Let's start with Mexico. What happened in Mexico to explain the dramatic decline in numbers that we see taking place on the southwest border? I'll give you three factors that I think are important to consider. First, in general, Mexico has experienced fairly robust economic growth over the past 30 years. Yes, they have suffered through some fairly dramatic economic crises in 1995, 2008 in particular. But in general, this upward trend in GDP per capita has outpaced its neighbors to the south, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And most importantly, much of this economic growth in Mexico has taken place in the top migrant sending states in that country. One misconception about migration from Mexico is that it's a nationwide phenomenon. And in fact, there's really 6 or 7 states in central western Mexico that send about 60 to 70% of migrants to the US. And those states include Guanajuato, Jalisco, Zacatecas, Estado de Mexico. And it is in these very same states where much of this economic growth has taken place over the past 20 years. Second reason that many scholars point to for the decline in the numbers from Mexico is the expansion of the H-2A visa program on the part of the US. What this visa program allows for is authorized workers to enter the US and work for temporary periods of time in the agricultural sector. And as you can see from the chart, the bulk of these visas go to Mexicans, and these numbers have steadily increased since 2008. So as Philip Martin at UC Davis noted, bottom line is that we are replacing aging unauthorized farm workers with legal Mexican H-2As, okay? Whoops. Okay, the third reason, and arguably the most important, is the demographics story coming out of Mexico. And here in this chart, you see the fertility rates of Mexico have dropped significantly since 1960, moving from about 6.8 to 2.2 in the past 5 or 6 years. The demographers will tell you that the population replacement level for fertility rates is 2.1. So what we see happening in Mexico is their baby boom is over. Families are no longer having 6 and 7 kids, but rather 2 or 3 kids. And the supply of potential migrants from Mexico has simply dropped significantly since over the past 20 years or so. If we look at the Central American fertility rates, the story is somewhat encouraging in the sense that those rates too are declining. If you look at El Salvador in blue, it's actually surpassed the rate of Mexico, dropping around 2.1, with Guatemala and Honduras lagging somewhat behind. But what this suggests is that over the next 10 to 20 years, we should see similar declines in numbers coming from the Central American countries. Okay, so those are the changes that have taken place in Mexico that contributed to the declining numbers from that country. What's been happening in Central America? Well, the story here is far more tragic, much less encouraging. And it revolves around the extremely high levels of insecurity in these 3 countries of Northern Central America. If we look at the chart of homicide rates per 100,000, you see that while Mexico has hovered around 20 per 100,000 over the past 20 years, increasing in the past 15 as the drug wars have flared up in that country. What we see, particularly in Honduras and El Salvador, are tragically high rates of homicide, almost warlike in terms of how many people are getting killed on an annual basis. We look at in 2015, the homicide rate for El Salvador exceeded 100. Just as a base of comparison, the US homicide rate in 2016 was 5.3 per 100,000. And Chicago, often considered one of the more violent cities in the US, its homicide rate in 2016 was 18.6 per 100,000. Again, in El Salvador, in 2015, it was over 100 per 100,000. As one scholar noted, as another aspect of this high insecurity in Northern Central America is the levels of extortion have increased quite a bit in the past decade or so. And extortion, according to Clavel, represents, quote, one of the leading causes of forced displacement in gang-controlled communities through the threat it poses to powerless civilians, especially women and children. And having done field work in some of these countries, some of the stories I've heard about the degree of extortion and the pervasiveness of this threat to the daily lives of families really kind of drives home the degree to which this serves as a push factor for many individuals seeking to leave this context. Other push factors include the governance failures of the 3 Central American governments. There are areas within each of these countries that have essentially been surrendered by the state to gangs. Extremely high levels of corruption in the government. Typically, these countries rank in the bottom half of countries around the world in terms of corruption indices and rule of law indices. And then finally, a third push factor is the climate. As you can see from this map, this is known as the dry corridor of Central America. And this area has suffered years of extreme drought and interspersed with some occasional extreme flooding. The entire region was hit by 2 hurricanes in November of 2020, and this is an indication of increasing vulnerability of citizens of these countries to climate related disasters. Okay, so to sum up the sources of these change in Mexico, it's the positive story of the economics, demographics, and this expanded use of temporary work visas. And in Central America, it's the tragic story of high levels of crime and insecurity, governance failures, and climate issues that keep pushing individuals to seek a better life elsewhere. And what this all suggests is that what we've seen happen on the southwest border is a change from what was once largely an economic migration flow, that is, individuals arriving at the border in search of economic opportunity. Typically, it was the young Mexican male seeking to work in the US for several years, earn some money, and then go back to Mexico. And now what we are seeing on the border is the arrival of a mixed migration flow that includes individuals that were motivated to leave their home countries for a variety of reasons. Okay, so now let's look at the southwest border policy and the US response to these changes. I think it can best be summed up by one size fits all. And you'll see what I mean in a second. All right, so mixed migration, as I say, is kind of what's been taking place over the past several years along the southwest border. This is a term used by migration scholars and agencies around the world to describe a migration flow that includes individuals leaving perhaps because of economics, but also in fear of their lives. You have unaccompanied minors, you have smuggled persons. All of these may form what is referred to as a mixed migration flow. And obviously, the policy challenges that this presents is that it makes it all the more difficult to develop a policy strategy that addresses the needs of the different types of migrants that are arriving. The one thing I want to point to that has kind of been the foundation for US, the legal standing of individuals arriving at the border seeking asylum is the US Code on Asylum that states any non-citizen who is physically present in the United States or who arrives in the United States, irrespective of such non-citizen status, may apply for asylum. And so we have a very clearly written legal code that grants individuals the right to apply for asylum if they step foot on US soil. All right, so how have the various administrations over the years responded to this? Well, I would characterize it as more policy continuity across administrations and differences of degrees. We have Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump all emphasizing border security, as we'll see in a minute. All 4 of those administrations emphasized deportations. Obama and Trump both sought to partner with Mexico to establish Mexico as essentially the first line of defense against individuals leaving Northern Central America. Obama and Trump also shared the policy strategy of a public relations campaign launched in Central America. Obama's in 2014 was referred to as the Dangers Awareness Campaign. That changed to the Know the Facts campaign in 2015. And the Trump's, the CBP in 2020 launched a Don't Risk Your Life video that was distributed across Central America. At the bottom, you see a billboard that was part of the Dangers Awareness campaign of Obama, where it says, I thought it would be easy for my son to obtain papers in the North. it wasn't true. And you see the forlorn, unaccompanied minor sitting lost in the desert. The underlying strategy of this public relations campaign is simply that if Central Americans only knew how hard it was to reach the US and how hard it would be to successfully immigrate to the US, then they wouldn't come at all. What this fails to recognize is the push factors oftentimes far outweigh any deterrence that the US can put in place. And so individuals will still seek to try to get across the border. Trump stands apart in one respect. His administration clearly focused on detentions, and most notably the family separation policy, and an attempt to stop asylum claims before they are made. That is, forcing individuals to remain in Mexico and to try to discourage them from even making asylum claims. Okay, so I'll just show you a few charts that underscore this kind of bipartisan approach to the southwest border that we've seen over the past 20 years or so. The US Border Patrol budget since 1990 has steadily increased, jumping in particularly during the Bush years, and then increasing on the tail end of the Obama administration and into the Trump administration. Border Patrol agents, the numbers increased again under Bush in particular, and then leveled off under Obama and Trump at around 20,000 Border Patrol agents. The focus on fencing or the border wall, whatever you want to call it, has been around long before Trump came. In 2006, Bush passed the Border Security Act, or the Secure Fence Act, excuse me, and this was approved 80-19 in the US Senate and passed 283 to 138 in the House. Again, kind of emphasizing the bipartisan approach to border security, which is let's build a border fence and ramp up security along the border. This resulted in about 700 miles of fencing out of the nearly 2,000 miles of the southwest border being constructed by 2015. And the Trump border wall system reports about 386 miles of completed construction. It's unclear how much of that is actually new construction and how much of it is simply refortification or a new fence in the place of what was put in place under the Secure Fence Act. Deportations. This is also a very common strategy that has been used by administrations on both sides of the aisle. As you can see, since 1995 under Clinton, deportations have increased dramatically. And with Obama kind of leading the way in terms of the absolute number of deportations taking place under his watch. As I mentioned, both Obama and Trump sought to partner with Mexico, and under Obama, he encouraged Mexico to implement the Plan Frontera Sur, the Southern Border Plan, which essentially consisted of Mexico reinforcing its border with Guatemala and serving as the kind of first front on stopping Central Americans from reaching the US border. This is similar to what Trump encouraged the current president of Mexico to do in recent years. And finally, detention as deterrence. Detention has often been kind of promoted and advertised in Central America as something that will happen to you if you try to cross the border. So, and this was really a strategy that most notably was adopted under Trump, as you can see with the increase in the average number of immigrant detainees, increasing quite a bit under his administration. I want to spend a minute talking about the math of immigrant detention. So we have, in 2019, about an average of 45,000 individuals being detained. The estimated average cost of detention for an adult is $134 a day. The average cost of detention for a family unit is $319 a day. Okay, just let that sink in for a second. Meanwhile, the average cost of what are known as alternative to detention programs, for example, phone check-ins, ankle bracelets and such, that cost is about $6 a day. So what's the payoff? Well, when you detain someone, you get 100% immigration court appearance rates, right? You know that person is going to show up for his or her immigration court appearance. With the alternative to detention programs, the rates range between 92 and 96%. So not much of a drop off for quite a bit of a savings. Finally, individuals with legal representation, regardless of whether they're in an alternative to detention program, their immigration court appearance rate is 96%. So with legal representation and alternative to detention programs, the rates get close to what we get from this very expensive detention program. Okay, so let's turn to the legal side, the court side of this mixed flow of migrants that have been appearing in recent years. And the US immigration court system, officially known as the Executive Office for Immigration Review, the EOIR, in 2018, the number of pending cases in the US court system, immigration court system, was 768,000. I'll let that sink in. The average number of days to final adjudication for an immigration case, 718 days. So again, going back to the cost of detention, if we're talking about detaining individuals until their cases are finally adjudicated, we're talking about paying for 718 days on average of detention at $133 a pop. The number of immigration court judges has increased in recent years, in large part due to the recognition under Obama that the number of judges was woefully low, given the number of cases that they were tasked with dealing with. And so even at 395, where it currently stands, or stood in 2018, we still need quite a bit of investment in the immigration court system. To further that point, a comparison of budgets of the Customs and Border Protection, ICE, and the EOIR. You can see the orange line is the budget for CBP. They take in or spend about $13.2 billion a year. In 2016, the budget for ICE was $6.1 billion, while for the immigration court system that is has a caseload of 768,000, their budget in 2016 stood at about 420 million. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the policy responses to the changes that have taken place between 2000 and 2020. And now let's take a brief historical look back, because we've been here before. And I'll explain what I mean. I want to go back to Central America in the 1980s, these very same countries, and that's not a coincidence. During the 1980s, the region was racked with violent civil wars, a civil war in Guatemala that had been going on for decades, civil war in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, and Honduras essentially served as a staging ground for military operations carried out against the guerrilla movements in its neighboring countries. As you can see from the chart, US involvement in these conflicts was quite extensive. Military aid in particular increased dramatically under the Reagan administration, particularly to El Salvador. And so the expected consequence of all of this bloody civil conflict was a tremendous upsurge in individuals seeking to flee these countries. And so what we see is a dramatic increase in the number of foreign-born individuals from these three countries living in the US that began precisely in the 1980s during this period of extreme levels of violence. Essentially what we have is the first Central American refugee crisis that government officials insisted on calling an immigrant crisis. But in fact, these individuals were refugees fleeing civil wars. And we see that beginning in 1980, the numbers from all three of these countries steadily increased. This again was a case of US rhetoric versus reality. Ronald Reagan, of all people, in a speech on Central America in 1984, in fact, referred to the individuals fleeing these wars as refugees. Quote, "In all of Central America, more than 800,000 have fled, many, if not most, living in unbelievable hardship. Concerns about the prospects of hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing communist oppression to seek entry into our country are well-founded." So two things to note here. First, he's referring to them as refugees. And second, he's revealing his foremost concern with the fact that the US would have to deal with a refugee crisis on its borders. Just 1 year earlier, Scott Burke, the Assistant Secretary of State for Asylum and Humanitarian Affairs in the Reagan administration, was quoted saying, "We think the majority of these people are economic migrants." So the policy approach of Reagan, Bush that followed him, and even Clinton in dealing with Haitian refugees following that country's turmoil was to deny entry of individuals, deny asylum claims to be made, and deny the US legal code that asylum claims are founded on. And by the way, the asylum approval rates for Salvadorans and Guatemalans during the 1980s in the US was less than 3%. What did this lead to? Well, it's not hard to guess. What this led to was hundreds of thousands of individuals from these three countries living in the US unauthorized because they could not gain legal status through asylum claims. And when individuals are unauthorized, they become vulnerable, they go underground, they can't seek out the help of police in situations. And the children of these unauthorized individuals found themselves living in large metropolitan areas, and many of them joined gangs for protection. And then this period was followed by a push by Clinton, Bush, and Obama to deport individuals with criminal records. So what this led to was the exporting of gang members from the US back to Central America, precisely back to El Salvador and Honduras. This report prepared for the Congressional Research Service noted that the expansion of MS-13 and 18th Street presence in Central America accelerated after the United States began deporting immigrants, many with criminal convictions, back to the Northern Triangle region after the passage of the Illegal Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act passed under Clinton in 1996. And these planted the seeds for much of the violence and forced migration that we are seeing today. Okay, so with my remaining time, I'll wrap up with a few closing observations. First of all, I hope you've taken away that we are witnessing a fundamental shift in US immigration patterns along the southwest border. How many are arriving? We're at unprecedented, well, levels that we haven't seen since the early 1970s. The question of who is arriving, it's no longer Mexicans primarily, but individuals from Central America, and particularly the 3 Central American countries we've been talking about. And the reasons why they are arriving have changed as well. It's no longer an economic migration flow, but rather at best a mixed flow, and some would characterize it primarily as a flow of refugees fleeing for their lives from unbearable conditions that they have to experience every day. And the simple fact is that US border policy has not been designed to deal with this mixed flow of migration. It was designed to dissuade young males from Mexico from seeking work in the US and turning them away at the border, not for the types of individuals that are arriving at the border today. Secondly, the link between US foreign policy and migration, as I just noted in the review of what happened in the 1980s, I think is pretty clear, and the consequences of the failure to address that refugee situation for what we're seeing today. And then with respect to the COVID-19 crisis that we've all experienced over the past year, the policies that this pandemic allowed the Trump administration to put into place without many obstacles, in my mind, simply delayed the issues that were underlying the flow of people arriving at the border. They did not solve any of these underlying issues. Essentially, they pushed everything onto the Mexican side of the border. And now all of that awaits the Biden administration to deal with in one way or another. Another aspect of the COVID crisis is the economic and social impact that it has had on the Central American countries. Along with the hurricanes they suffered in November of this past year, there's been stories of gangs increasing their control of neighborhoods during the pandemic. The economic crisis, many of us have felt in the US, and that's certainly been felt in Central America as well. So all of these point to a situation that has not gone away, that simply has been building up for a year and is left for the Biden administration to deal with. Okay, so I'll close with some policy options that have been talked about, put on the table, both by the Biden administration and others. First, if the election outcome had been different, we might still be talking about a border fence or wall. I'm not sure what impact that would have on the types of migration flows that we're talking about today. Funding for the Executive Office for Immigration Review, if it's the case that many of these individuals have legitimate asylum claims to be made, a beefing up of the US immigration court system seems to be a reasonable approach. One policy strategy that the Biden administration has put forth and is pursuing is development, trade, and partnering with Central America and Mexico to address the push factors that I've been talking about tonight. These entail targeted development and governance programs in high-sending areas of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And while they don't have very immediate payoffs, this is a very difficult policy to carry out, and the benefits tend to emerge down the road. It's a policy that I think will have the most sustainable payoffs in the long run. That said, it is a very difficult area to get involved in because of what I mentioned earlier, which is many in the governments of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador there's reports of vast amounts of corruption. And so giving money to the wrong people may in fact make the problem worse. A regional strategy for refugees has been talked about among refugee agencies. The UN agency has put forth some ideas about how to address this as a regional problem. Investment in the alternative to detention programs that I talked about earlier seems to be a viable policy option. Certainly one that would arguably save the US taxpayers lots of money as opposed to the detention program that we've been pursuing in recent years. And then finally, an expansion of worker visa programs such as H-2A and H-2B, expanding that into the making those more accessible to individuals from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador also seems to hold some chance for payoffs in terms of reducing the flows of individuals coming from that country. Okay, with that, I will end, but not before giving you that final reminder of the Central American map and my mnemonic: better get extra help, never commit plagiarism. Okay, so next time I see you, I want you to know that Central American map by heart. All right, now I look forward to talking with you and getting some of your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Hiskey. I'm certainly going to teach my kids the mnemonic, for sure. Appreciate that. I think if you all saw AJ early on in the chat said, if you have questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'd be happy to lead off with I had a couple of questions as you were going through, and so couple of things. Early on, you were talking about the apprehension rates and then talking about how they had increased from 50% to 70%. Mm-hmm. But it also sounded like we didn't have much really good data on EWIs, the entry without inspection. Right. Is that right? And mm-hmm. So I was wondering, so two questions really. One is related to that. One is, how do we know that, the apprehension rates are good if we don't know how many people are actually coming through?
Yeah, that's a great question. Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, I was thinking the other thing that you mentioned was, we saw the increase in per capita income in Mexico, and we see still a steady number of immigrants coming from the other Central American countries. Mm-hmm. Is there any thought there? Do we think that they would now immigrate to Mexico rather than to the U.S.? Is that a possibility as well? So
yeah, well, in fact, I'll address that first. Mexico certainly has seen an increase in Central American migrants staying in Mexico. And that was something that was occurring even before the Trump administration essentially forced individuals to stay in Mexico. And I think you're exactly right. The areas of Mexico that have experienced economic growth are seeing an increased presence of migrants from these countries. And so, yes, Mexico is becoming more and more a receiving country. Although interestingly, the last I checked, the largest migrant population in Mexico is Americans. American migrants or immigrants to Mexico are the most numerous among migrants. Again, that may have changed over the past couple of years, but that used to be the case. To your first question, so yeah, measuring the entries without inspection, in many ways it's similar to estimating the amount of illegal drugs that pass through our borders. Most of those estimates are based on how much the quantity of drugs that is confiscated. And you are exactly right to wonder how those estimates are arrived at. There are literally hundreds of pages of methodologies basically exploring different ways to assess the number the actual apprehension rate. Part of it is based on visible getaways, as they're referred to by Border Patrol. Part of it is based on calculations of what we know is the unauthorized population living in the US in a given year, and calculating off that. But a lot of it involves some fairly significant mathematical techniques to arrive at different estimates. Actually, the estimates I showed were averages of the range provided by the Office of Immigration Statistics, depending on the methodology they used. They arrive in 2005, I think it was, the range was 35% to 70%. So it really matters what methodology you use. And then in 2015, they, I think, have gotten a bit better at this. And the range was, what was it, 55 to 85, I think. Anyway, you're right. It's a process of estimation. And one thing I think is clear, though, that I would certainly hope that given the billions of dollars that we've invested in border security and border technology and border patrol staffing, that our apprehension rates have in fact gotten better over the past 20 years. And, whether it's, an increase of 20% effectiveness or 30%, I don't think we'll ever be certain about that, but I think we are pretty certain that the apprehension rate has improved during this time when we've invested so much money in it.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. It's probably very hard to estimate. So we did have another question that came in that kind of was aligned with the first question, about where immigrants are going, and this question was really actually why aren't any of the migrants or our migrants going south rather than coming up north to Mexico and the U.S.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk about that and
That's
why or why not?
Yeah, a very good question as well, and one that's been talked about. So one of the issues is, in recent years at least, is crossing through Nicaragua, which is a country with its own problems, more political than kind of gang related. Actually, the homicide rate in Nicaragua is quite low, and historically they've done a fairly good job of controlling the gang issue. Part of it is related to the economic draw of the U.S. I mean, we're talking about the U.S. has the world's largest economy versus going to Costa Rica, that while doing reasonably well, has nothing of the economic opportunities available in the U.S. And so even if one is fleeing for their lives, the choice of where to flee to becomes one of, okay, do I cross through Nicaragua and try to kind of find something happening in Costa Rica, or do I go through Mexico and try to enter into the world's largest economy? So the other aspect of that is in the U.S., in the worldview of the U.S. asylum process is that it will treat cases somewhat fairly, and whether or not that's accurate or not, I'm not sure. But the notion of going to the U.S. to make an asylum claim, given the legal statutes that are on the books in the U.S., has an appeal to individuals, I think, fleeing from these countries. And then finally, there are family and friend connections in the U.S. that make it a bit of a more appealing choice. And many of those connections developed, as we saw during that first wave of migration coming out of the civil wars of the 1980s. And so connections began to be made, and so the trip to the U.S. for individuals leaving these countries. There are communities of migrants from these countries that are living in Los Angeles, Chicago, elsewhere. And so that also has an appeal to individuals in terms of where they're choosing to leave to.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. And look, we've got time for a couple more questions. I'll I'll get one off here, but if you have any more, please, feel free to submit on the Q&A button. One of the things you talked about was in the deportation of the criminals, or the people that had come here and committed crimes, and so in particular El Salvador, right? And I think the question, I guess, would be, is there what's the effect of that, right? Is the effect just in El Salvador, or does it actually have an effect of those people or more people coming back to the U.S. as a result of fleeing the people who are going back to El Salvador? Is there kind of a vicious cycle of...
Yes, well, I mean, you've hit on it. It becomes a vicious cycle in the sense that, we've exported this gang problem back to Central American countries, and in turn, in subsequent years, the gang problem is a primary push factor for individuals leaving those countries and attempting to migrate to the US, not so much in terms of the gang members themselves, but rather the people that they are extorting on a daily basis, the young teenagers who are either the males who are forced into the gangs, the females who are raped as a part of a gang rite of passage. There's just the many number of stories that one can hear, paints a picture of individuals that just have to change, have to leave, and that, I think, is what we're seeing far more than what I think sometimes is portrayed as, the rapists and murderers that have been talked about by some. It's more the victims that are seeking to leave, and you're right. It does create a vicious cycle, and I don't know the answer to a question that would be about, so what are you suggesting? We don't deport individuals with criminal records? And I'm not suggesting that, but it's like I said, it's a difficult policy issue to grapple with.
Sure, there's a lot of things that affect it, and I'm sure when you make a policy, you've got to address many different things, and this may be a piece of that, right?
Mm-hmm. And one of the big complaints of Central American governments during the height of the deportation push in the U.S. was that simply plane loads of these young individuals were being dropped off in San Salvador and the other capital cities without any explanation of what their criminal records looked like, what they were involved with. They were simply kind of dumped back into the capital cities and left for the Central American governments to deal with. And generally speaking, to my knowledge, there's not that much in terms of resources and infrastructure to be able to handle that kind of influx of individuals coming into their country.
All right. So I guess along those lines, and maybe I'll just ask one more. The coordination among governments. I mean, I think you touched on it just there a little bit, but is that a part of these policies? And it sounds like it's not as much a part of the policies as one might think.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think there's and I think that's probably one area where it varies by administrations, both on the U.S. side and on the side of the Central American governments. There have been times and periods where an effort has been made to coordinate policies, and I'm encouraged by the current administration's past experiences with Central American governments. Biden knows what the issues are, and at least to this point, I'm encouraged by the extent of the emphasis he's put on addressing the push factors in a way that partners with Central American governments, not just dumping money into the countries, but figuring out how to strategically address some of the most severe push factors. And so, yes, I think you're absolutely right, Dan. It requires a partnership. And I think one of the problems with the Trump administration was, he used the stick far more than the carrot, and that's not going to, in the long run, I don't think, produce sustainable solutions.
Okay. We got time for, it sounds like we got one more question.
Okay, sure.
And it just came in, and so, I'm going to read it. Do you believe that regardless of our actions in those countries in the past, U.S. owes asylum to those citizens rather than have them go through the regular immigration process?
So the asylum process is the regular immigration process. I mean, there is a process that individuals are pursuing that is in the U.S. legal code, and they are abiding by what is on the books as U.S. law. So making a claim for asylum is not trying to kind of do a runaround to get into the U.S. Certainly, I'm sure there are individuals who don't have legitimate asylum claims, but that's for the U.S. immigration court system to adjudicate. That's what our system is based on. And so I don't really see the distinction being made between the immigration process and making an asylum claim, because I think, both are part of our immigration system. Now, to the first part of the question, do I think everyone should be given asylum fleeing these countries? And my answer is absolutely not. What I do think is that more people with plausibly legitimate asylum claims have been arriving at the US border in the past 5 to 10 years than we had seen in the previous 10 years. And with the exception of that 2019 caravan year, where my sense, and I don't have good data to substantiate this, but my sense is that there were a lot of individuals kind of joining in with the caravans that really led to that spike in numbers. But within that spike in numbers, there was still, a good segment that, again, have plausible asylum claims to make. Whether or not they would receive a positive ruling, that's a question for the courts. But my feeling on being able to make an asylum claim is you are playing by the rules. You are abiding by US legal code when you attempt to make an asylum claim. And the policies that deny people that right to make asylum claims, again, not judging whether they are going to be approved or not, they're not the lawbreakers. They're abiding by US legal code when they attempt to make an asylum claim.
Great. Well, I think we are a little bit past our time, so
Okay.
Wanted to say thank you so much, Professor Hiskey. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule and talking with us, and thank you everyone who joined the call. We've got.
Thank you all. I wish I could see you and have a glass of wine after the talk, as is the norm in these Commodore classrooms. But maybe next year I'll get to cross paths with some of you.
Yeah, certainly hope so. And then if you all have a chance, there's I think AJ posted a survey in the chat. So if you can take a little time and give us some feedback on this, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks again, Professor Hiskey. Really, really great talk.
Welcome. Thank you very much.